West Texas, August 1944. The afternoon sun burned white-hot over Camp Barkley, turning the parade ground into a furnace where 400 German prisoners stood at attention for evening roll call. Heat shimmered off the packed earth like water, distorting the distant mesquite trees into wavering shadows. Then a commotion near the main gate, a horse screaming, men shouting, dust rising in clouds that caught the slanting light. A cowboy appeared, leading a panicked quarter horse that was bleeding from barbed wire cuts. What he did next, one simple act, lasting maybe 3 minutes, stopped every conversation, silenced every voice, left 400 enemy soldiers standing perfectly still, watching something they would remember forever. Camp Barkley sprawled across 77,000 acres of Texas scrubland 7 miles southwest of Abilene. Established in 1940, it had trained entire divisions for deployment overseas, had processed tens of thousands of soldiers through its gates. By 1944, with victory in Europe approaching inevitability, Barkley had been partially converted to house German prisoners of war men captured in North Africa, Italy, and France, transported across the Atlantic to spend the war's remainder in West Texas heat. The landscape was unforgiving. Flat expanses broken by mesquite and cactus, temperatures that climbed above 100 degrees by midday, dust that coated everything with fine grit that tasted like iron. For Germans accustomed to European climates, Texas in August was a form of punishment that required no human cruelty to enforce. The sun handled that efficiently on its own. The prisoners worked. Agricultural details on nearby farms, maintenance crews within the camp, construction projects that supported the military's endless infrastructure needs. 8-hour days under guards, who were mostly either too old or too young for overseas deployment, supplemented by local civilians hired to supervise work details. Among these civilians, Jack Morrison, 58 years old, rancher turned contract supervisor when the war had created labor shortages that made his cowboy skills suddenly valuable to the military. Morrison had been working cattle since he was 12, had spent 46 years in the saddle, knew horses the way other men knew machines or books, intimately, instinctively, with understanding that transcended conscious thought. He was lean and weathered, face carved by wind and sun into topography that mapped every year spent outdoors. His hands were scarred from rope burns and barbed wire, his voice gravelly from decades of dust and cigarettes. He wore boots that had been resoled 3 times, a hat that had seen better decades, and carried himself with the unself-conscious confidence of men who have mastered skills that matter in the specific environment they inhabit. Morrison supervised a work detail of 30 prisoners clearing brush from Camp Barkley's perimeter. The Germans worked methodically under his direction, communicating through the basic English most had acquired and the universal language of manual labor that required no translation. Morrison treated them like hired hands rather than enemies, fair but firm, quick to correct mistakes, equally quick to acknowledge good work. One prisoner in particular had caught Morrison's attention. Werner Schmidt, 32 years old, from Bavaria, captured in France after the Normandy campaign. Werner had mentioned, through halting English and elaborate gestures, that he had grown up around horses. His family had owned a small farm. He understood animals. Morrison had tested this, assigning Werner to tasks that involved the camp's workhorses, draft animals used for hauling equipment. Werner handled them well, moved around them with competence, demonstrated the kind of comfort that only came from genuine experience. "You worked with horses before the war?" Morrison had asked one afternoon. Werner nodded. "My father had horses." "I helped many years. Miss it? Very much," Werner admitted. "Horses are honest. Better than people sometimes." Morrison had understood exactly what Werner meant. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon when the heat had peaked at 104 degrees and everything with sense was seeking shade. Evening roll call was scheduled for 1700 hours. The prisoners had been brought in from their various work details. were assembling on the parade ground for the daily head count that military procedures required. Morrison had been finishing paperwork in the civilian supervisor's office near the main gate when he heard the commotion. Hooves on packed earth, moving fast. A horse's scream high-pitched, terrified, men shouting. He looked up from his desk and saw a quarter horse galloping toward the gate, trailing reins, eyes rolling white with panic. Blood streaked its right flank and front legs. Fresh blood, bright red, running in rivulets down chestnut coat. Morrison moved on instinct. He was through the office door and into the horse's path before conscious thought engaged. The animal was heading straight for the fenced 12 feet of chain link that would shred it if it hit at full gallop. Morrison positioned himself, arms spread wide, making himself large and unmissable. The horse saw him, tried to veer, couldn't manage it at that speed. Morrison grabbed the trailing reins, let the horse's momentum spin him rather than trying to stop it directly. Used the rotation to slow the animal through physics rather than force. The horse came to a halt, sides heaving, still panicked but no longer running. Morrison kept his grip on the reins, began speaking in the low, steady tone he used with spooked animals. "Easy now, easy. You're all right. We're going to get you fixed up. Just easy." The horse tried to rear. Morrison held firm, moved with it, stayed close enough that the horse couldn't build momentum for another bolt. Behind him, 2 MPs had arrived, hands on their holsters, uncertain whether this situation required firearms or just patience. "What happened?" Morrison asked, not taking his eyes off the horse. One of the MPs explained. "Work detail near the west fence. Horse got tangled in barbed wire. Panicked, broke away from the handler. How bad's the wire damage? Can't tell. Blood's all over its legs." "Get me water and clean rags," Morrison said. "And someone find out who's supposed to be responsible for this animal." The MP departed. Morrison focused on the horse, running his free hand along its neck, checking for injuries while maintaining a steady stream of calm vocalization. The wounds were superficial but painful barbed wire cuts, the kind that looked worse than they were but still required treatment to prevent infection. The horse began to settle. Its breathing slowed from panicked gasping to merely labored. Its eyes stopped rolling quite so wildly. Morrison felt the animal's tension beginning to ease, the fight-or-flight response starting to recede as it recognized safety. The parade ground had gone quiet. 400 German prisoners stood at attention, but every eye was turned toward the scene at the gate. They had stopped talking, stopped shifting position, stopped doing anything except watching Morrison work with the panicked horse. Werner Schmidt stood in the front rank, close enough to see details. He watched Morrison's hands competent, gentle, never rough despite the horse's resistance. Watched his body language confident, but not dominating, working with the animal rather than forcing compliance. Watched the way Morrison spoke continuously, his tone more important than the words. Werner recognized this. He had seen his father work the same way with spooked horses, using patience instead of violence, building trust through consistency. But he had not expected to see it here, from an American, from an enemy who had no obligation to care about a military workhorse's welfare. The MP returned with water and rags. Morrison began cleaning the wounds, working carefully, letting the horse adjust to his touch before proceeding to the next injury. The cuts weren't as bad as the blood had suggested, mostly superficial, though painful enough to justify the panic. "You're going to be fine," Morrison told the horse. "These'll heal up clean if we keep them clean." He worked methodically, cleaning each wound, checking for embedded wire fragments, assessing what would need stitching versus what would close on its own. His movements were precise and practiced 46 years of experience, concentrated into 3 minutes of skilled care. On the parade ground, the silence deepened. Guards noticed their prisoners weren't responding to standard commands, followed the prisoner's attention to Morrison and the horse. They started to intervene, to restore discipline, but a sergeant held up his hand. Wait, let them watch. Because something was happening that transcended routine. The prisoners' men who had been trained to view Americans as enemy, who had spent months in captivity, processing defeat and displacement, were witnessing something that contradicted their programming. They were watching an American cowboy treat an injured workhorse with more care than many of them had seen extended to human beings during the war. The propaganda had been explicit. Americans were supposed to be materialistic, cruel, focused on efficiency over compassion. Cowboys especially depicted as violent, rough, obsessed with domination. But here was a cowboy being gentle, patient, treating an animal's suffering as something that mattered, something worth addressing immediately, despite the inconvenience. Werner felt tears building behind his eyes. He had not cried since capture, had maintained rigid emotional control through processing, transport, imprisonment. But watching Morrison work, watching American hands treat a horse with the same care Werner's father had shown, cracked something open inside him. Around him, other prisoners were similarly affected. Some German soldiers had been farmers, had known animals, understood what they were witnessing. Others simply recognized authentic skill and genuine compassion when they saw it, regardless of species or nationality. The horse calmed completely, stood still, let Morrison finish cleaning its wounds, accepted treatment that hours earlier would have triggered more panic. Morrison tied it to a fence post, gave it water, covered the worst wounds with clean cloth. Then he walked toward the parade ground. 400 pairs of eyes tracked his movement. He hadn't intended to create this moment, had simply responded to an emergency the way 4 decades of experience demanded. But now 400 German prisoners were staring at him with expressions he couldn't fully read. Morrison stopped at the edge of the formation, looked at the sea of enemy faces, shrugged slightly as if embarrassed by the attention. Horse got cut up, he said simply. Needed help. That's all. The sergeant in charge of roll call cleared his throat. All right, back to procedure. Sound off by barracks. The spell broke. Roll call proceeded. But something had shifted in ways that would take days or weeks to fully manifest. That evening, after the prisoners had been dismissed to their barracks, Werner approached the fence that separated prisoner compound from civilian administrative areas. Morrison was still there, checking on the horse one more time before heading home. "Excuse me," Werner called out in careful English. "Sir, I may speak with you?" Morrison turned. Recognized Werner from the work detail. "Yeah, what do you need?" Werner gestured toward where the horse was stabled. "That was." He struggled for words. "That was good thing you did. With the horse." "Just doing what needed done?" "No." Werner shook his head. "It was more than necessary. You cared about animal suffering. You took time, showed patience." Morrison leaned against the fence. "Yeah, well, horse didn't ask to be here. Didn't ask to get tangled in barbed wire. Seemed only right to help it. In Germany," Werner said quietly, "we were taught Americans are cruel, that you value only money, power, that cowboys are violent. But today I watched you be gentle, watched you care about something that had no value except as tool." Morrison considered this. "Your propaganda lied to you. Not just about Americans, I'd guess, about a lot of things." Werner nodded slowly. "Yes, I am understanding this more each day." "I'll tell you something," Morrison said. "Don't matter what country you're from, good people treat animals right. Bad people don't. That's not about nationality. That's about character. My father," Werner said, "he taught me this. He said how a man treats animals, that shows who he really is. Your father was right." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Morrison asked, "You miss your family's farm?" "Every day. Every moment. The horses especially. There is ... peace ... and working with them. They are honest, like I said. "When this war ends and you go home," Morrison said, "you get yourself some horses. Build that peace again. World's gonna need more peace and less fighting." Werner felt his throat tighten. "Thank you for showing me today that such peace still exists." The story of Morrison and the horse spread through the prisoner barracks that night. Not as entertainment, the tone was too reverent for that, but as something else. Evidence, proof, a data point that contradicted years of propaganda. One prisoner, Otto, from Hamburg, formerly an engineer, tried to contextualize what they had witnessed. It's one incident. One cowboy. Doesn't necessarily represent broader American character. But Werner disagreed. "I worked under him for 6 weeks. Every day, he was fair. Firm but fair, never cruel. Treated us like workers, not enemies. Today just made visible what he has been all along." Another prisoner, Karl from Dresden, added, "I have watched guards here for months. Some are harsh, some are indifferent. But many are like this Morrison professional, but not cruel. They follow Geneva Convention not because they must, but because they believe in it." Otto remains skeptical. Or they follow it because their leadership requires it. Individual kindness doesn't prove systemic decency. But Werner had been thinking about this since watching Morrison work. The propaganda told us Americans lack culture, lack values. Yet I watched a cowboy treat an injured horse with more care than our military doctors treated wounded soldiers in final days of the war. That is culture. That is values. Just different from what we were taught to recognize. The conversation continued late into the night. Not everyone was persuaded. Some prisoners maintained rigid adherence to the worldview they had been taught, unable or unwilling to process contradictory evidence. But others began reconsidering, began questioning, began allowing doubt to enter spaces where certainty had previously ruled. Werner lay in his bunk that night and thought about his father's farm in Bavaria. The horses they had raised, the care his father had shown them. The morning routines, the evening chores, the satisfaction of work that produced tangible good. He wondered if the farm still stood, if his family had survived, if returning home would mean rebuilding from ruins. But he also thought about Morrison's words. "Hit yourself some horses. Build that peace again." A suggestion that peace was something you could build, deliberately and intentionally, rather than something that simply happened in war's absence. That idea felt revolutionary. Over the following weeks, Morrison noticed changes in how the German prisoners interacted with him. More respectful, more attentive, more willing to engage. Werner especially seemed transformed, approaching work details with engagement that went beyond mere compliance. One afternoon, while the crew was repairing fencing, Werner asked, "Mr. Morrison, you teach me more about horses?" "I want to remember correctly for when I return home." Morrison looked up from the post he was setting. "Yeah, I can do that. What do you want to know?" "Everything. How to treat injuries, how to read their behavior, how to build trust with new horses." "All of it?" "That's a tall order," Morrison observed. "But all right. We'll work it in during breaks." And so Morrison began teaching. Not formally nothing that would violate regulations about fraternizing with prisoners, but through casual demonstration and explanation during work breaks. How to approach a spooked horse. How to check for lameness. How to recognize colic symptoms. Basic veterinary care using minimal equipment. Werner absorbed it all with desperate focus. This knowledge felt like treasure, like pieces of future he was assembling from rubble of past. Each skill Morrison shared was a brick in the foundation of whatever life Werner would build when he returned to Germany. Other prisoners noticed and asked to learn too. Morrison found himself running impromptu classes, teaching German prisoners horsemanship in the margins of official work duties. The guards noticed, but didn't interfere. This was harmless, probably beneficial for prisoner morale, and Morrison's supervision had never caused problems. By September, Werner could diagnose and treat basic equine injuries. Could gentle a difficult horse with patience and consistency. Could read animal behavior well enough to predict and prevent problems. Morrison watched this and felt something unexpected pride. Not because Werner was German or prisoner or former enemy, but because the young man was genuinely good with horses and was getting better. "You've got the touch," Morrison told him one afternoon. "Horses trust you. That's not something you can fake." "My father had the same gift," Werner replied. "I hope I can be even half the horseman he was." "You're well on your way," Morrison assured him. In October, Werner received a letter from the Red Cross. His family had been located. His father was alive, though injured. The farm had been damaged in bombing, but was repairable. His mother and sister had survived. He had a home to return to, family waiting, a future that suddenly felt concrete rather than abstract. He shared this news with Morrison the next day. "My father, he is alive. The farm stands. I will have work when I am repatriated." Morrison smiled. "That's good news. Real good news." "Your father teach you horses the way you tell me?" "Yes. Everything I knew before came from him. Everything I learned here came from you. When I return, I will have both sets of knowledge." "You tell your father something for me," Morrison said. "Tell him he raised a son who knows how to treat animals right. That matters. That's worth being proud of." Werner felt his eyes sting again. "I will tell him. And I will tell him about the American cowboy who taught me when he had no obligation to do so." Morrison waved this off. "Just passing forward what someone taught me once. That's how knowledge works. It's passed along, generation to generation." "Still," Werner insisted, "you chose to teach enemy prisoner. That is generous beyond requirement." Morrison looked at Werner seriously. "War makes enemies, but war ends. When it ends, you'll go back to Bavaria, and I'll stay in Texas. What we'll have in common is we both know horses. That's more real than enemy and ally. That's something that lasts." Repatriation schedules came through in November. Werner's name appeared on a manifest for December transport. He would be going home for Christmas, returning to a Bavaria. It was occupied and devastated, but still home, still family, still future. His last day at Camp Barkley, Morrison gave him a gift. A book worn, well-used, annotated in the margins with 4 decades of notes. A comprehensive guide to horse care, covering everything from basic maintenance to complex veterinary procedures. "Can't read most of the words yet," Werner said, paging through the English text, "but I will learn. I will study until I understand every page." Morrison pointed to the illustrations and diagrams. "Pictures will help until your English improves." And here he handed Werner a folded paper, wrote out some key terms with German translations. Not perfect, but should help you navigate. Werner clutched the book like scripture. "This is too valuable. I cannot take. It's more valuable in hands that'll use it. Book doesn't do anybody good sitting on my shelf. You take it, use it, maybe pass it to someone else who needs it someday." "I will." Werner paused, struggling for English adequate to express what he felt. "You changed my understanding. Of Americans. Of enemies. Of what is possible when people choose kindness over cruelty. Just treated you decent. That's not extraordinary, that's baseline. But it was extraordinary. After years of propaganda telling us Americans are materialistic and cruel, watching you care for injured horse, watching you take time to teach me that destroyed the lies, made me question everything I had been taught." Morrison nodded slowly. "Good. Keep questioning. Don't accept what you're told just because someone with authority says it. Trust what you see. Build your understanding from evidence. This is what I will teach my children," Werner promised. To question, to observe, to judge people by actions rather than propaganda. They shook hands. 46 years of Texas ranching meeting 32 years of Bavarian farming, connected across the gap of wartime enmity by shared understanding of horses and the value of treating animals right. Werner Schmidt returned to Bavaria in December 1945. The farm was damaged, but repairable. His father was recovering from injuries sustained in the war's final chaos. The horses were gone, either taken by retreating military forces or lost to the destruction that had swept across Germany. But Werner had knowledge, had skills refined through months of Morrison's teaching, had a book filled with information about horse care, written in a language he was learning to read. And he had the memory of an American cowboy who had chosen kindness when cruelty would have been easier. He rebuilt, slowly, painfully, over years rather than months. Acquired horses, first one, then two. Eventually a small breeding operation that served the agricultural needs of rebuilding Bavaria. Applied what Morrison had taught him. Treated animals with the care and patience he had witnessed that August afternoon when a panicked horse had galloped toward a fence and a cowboy had chosen to help. His father noticed. "You learned something in America," he observed. "Your hands move differently, more confident." Werner told him about Morrison, about the work details, the impromptu lessons, the book that had been gifted despite regulations that discouraged exactly that kind of personal connection between guard and prisoner. His father listened and nodded slowly. "The Americans beat us in war. But this Morrison, he also taught you. That is more powerful than defeating. That is building something instead of just destroying." Werner agreed. "I was taught to hate Americans." Morrison made that impossible. Not through arguing or debating, but through simply being decent. That decency was more powerful than any propaganda. Werner Schmidt rebuilt his family's farm into modest prosperity over the following decades. He became known throughout the region as an expert horseman, someone farmers called when animals needed special care or difficult training. He taught others passing forward what Morrison had passed to him. In 1965, Werner's son, named Jack after Morrison, asked about the worn book that sat on the mantel in their home. The pages were fragile now, the annotations faded, but the book remained the family's most treasured possession. "What is this?" Jack asked in German. "Your grandfather's most important inheritance," Werner replied. "Given to me by an American cowboy who chose to teach an enemy prisoner when he could have chosen indifference or cruelty." He told his son the story. A panicked horse, the 3 minutes of skilled care that silenced 400 prisoners, the months of learning that followed. The simple act that had rewritten Werner's understanding of who Americans were and what enemies could become to each other. "Why did he teach you?" Jack asked. "What did he gain?" Werner considered. "Nothing material." But Morrison believed knowledge should be passed forward. Believed that teaching was obligation for those who knew things. Believed that enemies in war could be colleagues in craft. "And you've passed this forward?" "Yes. Everyone I've taught horses to, I've told them about Morrison. About choosing patience over force. About treating animal suffering as important. About the American cowboy who proved propaganda wrong through simple decency." Jack absorbed this. So the book isn't just about horses. It's about everything else, too. "Exactly," Werner confirmed. "It's about questioning what you're told. About judging people by actions rather than nationality. About the power of one person choosing kindness in circumstances that don't require it." Jack Morrison never knew about his influence on Werner Schmidt. He died in 1968 at age 82, having spent his entire life in West Texas working cattle and horses. His obituary mentioned his ranching career, his work supervising POW labor during the war, his reputation as a skilled horseman. It didn't mention the August afternoon in 1944 when he had calmed a panicked horse in front of 400 German prisoners. But that afternoon echoed forward anyway. Werner Schmidt told the story for 50 years to his children, to his students, to anyone who would listen. The tale of the American cowboy who had silenced an entire POW camp, not through violence or dominance, but through competence and compassion. In 1995, Werner traveled to Texas. He was 78 years old, making a pilgrimage to places from his past. Camp Barkley had been deactivated in 1946. The land returned to civilian use. Nothing remained of the barracks or parade ground where he had witnessed Morrison's simple act. But Werner found Morrison's grave in a cemetery outside Abilene. He stood there for a long time, this elderly German man beside the grave of an American cowboy he had known for 4 months 50 years earlier. He placed a photograph, his son Jack, named for Jack Morrison, standing beside 3 horses on the rebuilt Bavarian farm. Written on the back in English, Werner had finally mastered, "These horses exist because you taught me. This life exists because you chose kindness. Thank you for showing me that enemies can become teachers, and that the best way to defeat propaganda is simply to be decent." The grave offered no response. But Werner felt he had fulfilled an obligation acknowledging a debt that could not be repaid but could be recognized. He returned to Germany and continued the work of teaching. Every student he trained heard about Morrison. The story became legend in Bavarian horse training circles. The American cowboy who had taught a German POW, and in doing so had passed forward knowledge that had sustained 3 generations. When Werner died in 2003 at age 86, his obituary mentioned his expertise in horse training, his reputation for patience and skill. It mentioned that he had been a POW in America during World War II and had learned valuable skills during his captivity. What it couldn't capture was the moment 3 minutes on a Texas afternoon when a cowboy had calmed a panicked horse and in doing so had silenced 400 men. Not through force, not through authority, but through simple demonstration that competence and compassion were more powerful than propaganda. That skill transcended nationality, and that the way a person treated an injured animal revealed more about their character than any ideology could claim. That moment had rippled forward. Through Werner's life, through his children's lives, through the hundreds of people he taught over 5 decades. Each person carrying forward not just horsemanship skills, but the larger lesson that enemies were temporary, that craft was permanent, and that choosing to be decent in moments that didn't require it could change the trajectory of lives in ways that neither teacher nor student could fully predict. Morrison's simple act, 3 minutes of skilled care given to a panicked, injured horse, had silenced an entire POW camp. But the silence hadn't been empty. It had been filled with the sound of certainty cracking, propaganda failing, minds opening to the possibility that what they had been taught might be wrong. And that sound, that moment of realization, had echoed across decades and an ocean, proving that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply be competent and kind when circumstances give you the choice to be cruel.